The German Bayer Group is under pressure. The price of shares is at rock bottom. The controversial issue, pesticides, with fatal side effects.
It was the world's largest legal bee poisoning.
They have been on the market for decades. An early suspicion, Bayer's pesticides do not only poison bees.
They are everywhere, which poses a global problem for biodiversity.
There is an environmentally friendly alternative, threadworms, just as effective but without side effects.
The chemical industry like to lobby against this.
The result, natural crop protection without a chance so far. The Rhine Plain in the Breisgau is a fertile area. Lots of corn, lots of rapeseed. The bees of Christoph Koch normally lead a good life here. For the beekeeper, the industrious insects are like family members. A bee colony can produce up to 50 kilos of honey per season, if it stays healthy.
They're fantastic creatures. Every bee here knows what it has to do. Just imagine it's pitch dark in there, and they make such a precise honeycomb. It's accurate to the millimeter. Each bee knows what it has to do, none complains. They dance with joy when they're allowed to collect honey when they work. Bees are so frugal.
The beekeeper never had any problems with pesticides until 2008. A new vermin had appeared in the Rhine Valley. The authorities allowed the massive use of an insecticide from the Neonicotinoid group. As the maize cultures no longer had to be sprayed, the environmental impact was classified as extremely low. The seed machines press the poisoned seeds into the soil. The neonicotinoids then act from the root to the stems. The plants are thus protected against attacks by harmful beetles on the upper plant parts and against larvae in the soil. But in 2008, this sowing technique was to become the bee's doom.
A corn farmer drove ahead of me to sow his corn. And from one moment to the next, the bees didn't fly anymore. It was brilliant weather, everything was wonderful. And while he was doing his sowing, it stopped. There were no more bees flying.
The reason? When the seeds are pressed, pesticide dust is released into the environment. The poison cloud killed around 12,000 bee colonies. 500 million animals died an agonizing death.
That was the world's largest legal bee poisoning, since bee protection has been practiced at all. It was very frustrating, very emotional. I was in a very sad mood. I couldn't even go to the bees anymore, because if you drove to the apiary, you could smell the decaying bees. I couldn't cope with it.
Christoph Koch also lost all 233 bee colonies. He was sure that the poison dust was to blame, but the authorities came to a different conclusion. Not the neonicotinoids, but the defective seed machines and poor disinfection led to the catastrophe. An accident. The beekeeper still mistrusts this judgment today. Koch is convinced that the neonicotinoids kill the pollinators, even when used correctly.
There were indications from France that when sowing sunflowers and maize, bees can massively poison themselves. There were further indications that it disturbs the orientation in the bee colonies from France and Italy. They did not find their way back to the bee colony.
Already at that time, the suspicion that neonicotinoids are far more dangerous than assumed intensified. That's why these insecticides were banned from corn cultivation in Germany in 2008. Natural methods were initially not considered at all in order to protect crops from their predators. August 2019, 11 years after the disaster, the vermin, the western corn rootworm, is still there. Employees of the Freiburg Regional Council observed the development of the populations. In networks, they count the number of animals. In order to contain them, a non-toxic alternative is now being used.
The most successful method is crop rotation. This means a maximum of 2 consecutive maize runs, and then there must be a year's break. If I do not cultivate maize in the following year, 98% of the maize rootworm on the respective area will die.
A tried and tested method, which of course was also known in 2008, was the use of insecticides, which killed millions of bees, even necessary? Raphael Maurat from the Breisgau district office advised farmers on the use of neonicotinoids back then. Do you think that this measure was like breaking a butterfly on a wheel?
One could say that, but as I said, for necessary reasons. You saw yourself exposed to a wave of the population that is spreading here. They wanted to create this original state of corn rootworm freedom, and perhaps they went a little too far.
Did you already know back then that there were problems with neonicotinoids in France, that it was forbidden?
We heard about it.
Nevertheless, at that time, the western corn rootworm was to be exterminated under all circumstances, with neonicotinoids. Many farmers even more than doubled the dose on the advice of Freiburg's Regional Council. This was probably the final death blow for the bees. The fear that the western corn rootworm will become a serious threat again and again has remained. Especially the larvae are greedy. Their favorite meal is the roots of the plants. They reproduce especially when there is no crop rotation. In this case, there is a natural alternative instead of pesticides. A company in Kiel has specialized in organic pesticides. Nematodes are bred in the laboratories. The nematodes are so-called dour juvenile, that are adapted to a longer life in the soil. They are tiny and the arch-enemy of the western corn rootworm. The useful creatures penetrate the larvae and transmit deadly bacteria there. The host animals die after about 2 days. There are no dangerous residues like in chemical products. The success rate is also the same as for chemical pesticides, as are the costs. Until application, they are preserved in a special powder made of clay minerals. The animals are harmless to humans.
A handful of this nematode powder contains about 30 million nematodes. You need about 500,000 to 100,000 per square meter. If you apply chemical pesticides, you have to wear protective clothing, and in some cases a mask, because they have a very strong effect on the lungs. Of course, this is not possible here. You have to protect yourself from dust, but the fact that this is damp now, because the nematodes are contained in it, it no longer stirs up the dust. It's harmless.
The only expense, they have to be kept cool until they are applied. Then they are mixed with water. In practice, hydraulic sowing machines shoot the nematodes with the maize seed grains into the soil in spring.
The nematodes, of course, have the advantage that apart from these corn rootworm, hardly any other organisms are affected. This means that the beneficial organisms that move in the field are not affected. Only the corn rootworm larvae and perhaps a few insects larvae, which are also in the track. This cannot be ruled out, but it is very targeted, meaning we don't create any ecological problems otherwise.
Many agricultural poisons could be replaced by environmentally friendly substances. However, the market share of organic crop protection applications worldwide is just 5%. For years, organic suppliers have been waging a hopeless battle against chemical multinationals such as Bayer, Syngenta and BASF.
Biological crop protection has always been very ridiculed. It was claimed that it doesn't work or is too expensive, which of course isn't true. This led to the fact that often it wasn't promoted in the same way. The chemical industry also liked to lobby against it with these arguments, so that organic plant protection always had a bad image.
Chemistry governs conventional agriculture. This is where the big money is made. At Bayer AG, for example, annual stockholders meeting spring 2019. A year ago, the company swallowed the US chemical giant Monsanto for 60 billion euros. But the deal backfired. Today, there is a threat of a shareholder uprising because Bayer's stock market value is at rock bottom because of glyphosate and the billions in lawsuits before US courts. And so is its image. For the demonstrators, Bayer, like Monsanto, is the symbol of rampant greed for profit regardless of people or the environment, also because of its own insecticides, neonicotinoids. The beekeepers demand an immediate halt to sales.
We're victims. We achieve so much for society. We, or rather our bees, ensure pollination. And this is what we get.
Beekeepers blame the producers of neonicotinoids for the main cause of bee mortality. For years, Bayer has been able to defend the approval of neonicotinoids using extremely questionable methods. Serious allegations. But are they true? Did the DAX group play tricks? And what about the authorities? Why didn't they react? The first trace leads to France. Here, the first of 5 neonicotinoids was approved in the EU in 1992. In Orléans, toxicologist Jean-Marc Bonmartin has been researching Bayer toxins for a long time. In the mid-1990s, beekeepers noticed that masses of bees died in sunflower fields. The French Ministry of Agriculture then arranged for an investigation to be carried out. Under suspicion, the neonicotinoids. Amongst the managing committee of the study, representatives of Bayer.
I think it's normal for a company like Bayer to be informed that a study is being conducted on one of its products, but it's absolutely not normal for this company, whose products ultimately have to be decided on, to be involved in the detailed study design, financing, and even the final results.
The result of this study was very important for Bayer. For the study, bees were sent to sunflower fields with neonicotinoids, and then on control fields without any insecticides. A clean comparison. One field with toxins, one without. Jean-Marc Bonmartin and his colleagues were only supposed to analyze the fields with the Bayer toxin and not the control field. However, it turned out that the control field had also been treated with an insecticide.
We scientists complained about this test series when we saw that the control fields had been treated with fungicides and insecticides, and this did not seem normal to us for a test series of this quality. But our complaint was not heard by the managing committee of this study. Instead, the results of this comparative study, which we now know was worthless, were interpreted as evidence that imidacloprid, a neonicotinoid, is harmless to bees.
Par la suite comme étant la preuve de l'innocuité de l'imidaclopride, donc des néonicotinoïdes, pour les abeilles.
In public, Bayer's toxins are suddenly beyond suspicion. A ban has been removed for the time being. Bonmartin's institute now undertakes its own studies on behalf of the beekeepers without Bayer. This time with different results.
We could prove that the maize, sunflowers, pollen, nectar, water, everything that concerned the bees were contaminated, and that the dosages that could be found in the wild were so high that they were sufficient to lead to death in the bees, or at least to severe long-term effects.
Bonmartin's studies led to France being the first country in the world to ban a neonicotinoid in 1999. This is tolerable for the group. Bayer and other manufacturers such as Syngenta sell the neonicotinoids in over 100 countries. A billion-dollar business. Already in 2012, Planet E reported on the poisons. Bayer shows the test tents in which plants were allegedly treated with the toxins. It's not said with which dose. In any case, the bees are doing well. Many of Bayer's own studies have proven this, says Bayer.
In our studies, we've never noticed any negative effects in neonicotinoids under practical conditions.
No negative effects in Bayer house studies. A quite remarkable finding. Several hundred other studies come to different conclusions, worldwide and conducted by various institutes and scientists. For instance, by toxicologist Francisco Sanchez Bayo. The scientist was called to Japan in 2002. He was to investigate a strange incident in irrigated rice fields. Water fleas, crayfish and a special fish species also lived there. Suddenly, almost all fish and crayfish had died. The water fleas, on the other hand, were undamaged. In the laboratory, Sanchez Bayo found out that the rice fields had been treated with neonicotinoids. A former Bayer employee was also involved as a consultant. The same neonicotinoid that had killed the bees in France quickly came under suspicion.
We nevertheless observed a very curious thing. The medaca that were in the mesocosms treated with imidacloprid were absolutely all, 100% of the fish were contaminated with a protozoan parasite. And of course, we put it down to the fact that imidacloprid, like other neonicotinoids, inhibits the immune system. So it's all species were sensitive to the insecticide, except Daphnia. So that was the unusual thing. So Daphnia was an anomaly. And the unfortunate fact is that this anomaly had been used as the reason to say that this insecticide was safe for the environment, when it was a complete anomaly.
The poison didn't kill the tiny little water fleas, but the bigger types. It weakened their immune system to such an extent that parasites had an easy time of it. The toxicologist believed that the result was clear and wanted to discuss it with the Bayer consultant. But this put the toxicologist under pressure, probably also because he helped develop the neonicotinoids.
The day I explained the results of the first year mesocosm studies to the whole group and to the faculty, at the end, he just couldn't understand the results himself, and he asked me, so what are you going to do with these results? And I said, well, the first thing I'm going to do is to publish them, because it's something, a novelty. And he really didn't know what to say. He was speechless and said, do you really want to publish it? And I said, yes, I think it's important to let the world know what's happening. But they wanted to keep it secret. They didn't want to publicize something which would be damaging for the company.
Sanchez Bayo says that the lab then gave him notice. He nevertheless published the results. The incidents prove it. At least one Bayer scientist apparently knew very early on what neonicotinoids can do to ecosystems. Research that requires a comment from Bayer. After weeks of trying to get an interview, the final refusal. We only get to the factory gate. Even a list of questions submitted is not answered. Instead, the company criticizes what it considers to be unfair treatment by the media and writes in a general statement, Bayer remains convinced that the use of neonicotinoids is safe for humans and the environment, if they are used responsibly and in accordance with the instructions for use. The poisons didn't kill the bees and other species. Bayer has been saying for years that there are no long-term effects either. It seems that the results of other studies are of no interest. For there are now many independent scientists worldwide who disagree. Dutchman Henk Tennekes has been researching Bayer poisons for years. His conclusion? Never before has there been a more dangerous insecticide. The bees are only one indication. The whole environment is affected. We meet Tennekes in a rehabilitation center. Even though he has pneumonia, he agrees on an interview.
The neonicotinoids are water-soluble and relatively mobile in the soil, and therefore they are easily washed out during precipitation into the groundwater and surface waters, and thus spread into the whole environment, and are also absorbed by wild plants via the roots. And this leads to the fact that the whole landscape is actually poisonous for insects, and one can express a suspicion that it will lead to insect deaths. And when the insects disappear, the system collapses. And that is why it's an ecological armageddon. We're about to destroy all of nature.
Tennekes and many other scientists are convinced that when insects die, there is a domino effect. Then there is no more food for birds, reptiles and amphibians. There is the threat of a dormant landscape. Bayer has been selling neonicotinoids worldwide for 27 years. Shortly after approval, one of the toxins was banned in France after first critical studies. In Japan, scientists proved that the insecticides kill other species. But what happened in Germany? Here too the beekeepers complained about mysteriously high losses with their bees. A study of the cause was to get to the bottom of this. The professional beekeepers and their president, Walter Hefeker, were also involved. But soon they recognized the real purpose of the so-called German bee monitoring.
The German bee monitoring came into being after, according to our observation, the danger existed that the procedure could spread from France to Germany.
The fear that the poisons would also be banned here was obviously great. Did the industry want to exclude this risk? Bayer and Syngenta, two manufacturers of neonicotinoids, were also taking part in the study. The beekeeper's boss soon noticed that something was going massively wrong.
Every year there was an annual report, and every year the reports went through the press again. The Varroa mite is terrible, but we can't find anything in the pesticides section. And that actually worked perfectly. Of course, we have increasingly criticized how the whole project is structured, that one couldn't even find a connection with this method, even if it were there.
Zusammenhang auch gar nicht finden könnte, selbst wenn da wäre.
The neonicotinoids have nothing to do with bee mortality. That was the result. The beekeepers are outraged, also because the study was fully financed by industry with €500,000 over 5 years.
If you look at the financing of the project, there is an obvious explanation. He who pays the piper calls the tune. The money for the German bee monitoring came more or less exclusively from the pesticide producers.
The professional beekeepers left the project in protest. They couldn't trust the industry. Over the years, there has been increasing evidence of how dangerous neonicotinoids really are. However, the authorities responsible for the approval of neonicotinoids are hesitant or do not react at all. The Federal Office of Consumer Protection and Food Safety is responsible for the approval, along with the Julius Kühn Institute, the Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, and the Federal Environment Agency. Have they ignored the real dangers of neonicotinoids for years? Are they indirectly responsible for the death of insects? The Federal Office of Consumer Protection writes in a statement, "It's scientifically not correct to speak of the real danger, since numerous studies have not proven negative effects on the honeybee." It remains unclear which investigations the authority means. What's certain is that its findings contradict those of the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA. It had evaluated 1,500 studies. Based on EFSA's risk assessment, 3 out of 5 neonicotinoids were banned throughout Europe in 2018 to protect bees. Neonicotinoids. First the approval, then the dispute over bee mortality, and then the ban. A confused situation. How could this happen? A look at the European approval procedure. For the active substance itself, the manufacturer may choose any EU member state. The approval is then valid for the entire EU. The manufacturers themselves test their own active ingredients for toxicity and environmental compatibility. The authorities do not carry out any studies, only desk work. Co-formulants are added to turn the active ingredient into a pesticide product. In this way, the agent can function optimally for the respective crops or pests. The finished product is approved individually for each EU country. Neonicotinoids were also approved according to this method. The approval studies of the manufacturers are the exclusive basis. The authorities have no problem with it. For beekeeper President Walter Hefecker, however, this system opens the door to industry for manipulation.
It starts with the fact that they have a say on all conceivable levels. Considering how the prescribed tests are carried out, that means the test regime is then fixed. So far, it was also the case that this study, which was commissioned or prepared by the manufacturer, was the manufacturer's trade secret, so it could not be published. And so it was not comprehensible to outsiders what the approval authority actually checked there. This also makes it very easy for the approval authority, because nobody can really check the decisions. So there was a very convenient interaction between industry and the regulatory authority.
Zusammenspiel zwischen Industrie und Regulierungsbehörde.
An EU directive aimed at tightening up the approval of pesticides has still been on hold for 6 years. For critics, this is the result of successful lobbying of the industry. Manufacturers of organic pesticides also feel outmaneuvered. The E-Nema company in Kiel is successful with nematodes. It doesn't need any approval for this. In the case of other bioactive substances, such as microorganisms or fungi, the company has backed out. Because the mostly harmless natural products are approved like chemical plant protection agents, the procedure can then drag on for years, and the ordered tests are often superfluous for the biomedicines.
There is no scientific sense behind these exaggerated approval conditions. It's certainly more a matter of other interests which play a role. That's difficult to prove, of course, but I do think that there have been certain political circles that said that they do not want these organic pesticides on the market.
The business model chemical pesticides has been almost unchallenged for decades, but bee mortality has changed everything. More and more critical questions are being asked, which the large corporations don't answer at all or only inadequately. Alternatives have been available for many years. To promote them, to give them more room, that is precisely the task of a clever agricultural policy.